On December 7, 1941, the Pacific War erupted in fire and smoke. American sailors at Pearl Harbor watched as Japanese aircraft screamed overhead, leaving devastation in their wake. Among the attackers were sleek, pale green fighters that seemed almost untouchable, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. For many Americans, this was their first glimpse of the plane that would dominate the early months of the Pacific War. Its reputation would grow quickly, part machine, part myth, and for nearly a year it seemed unstoppable. The Zero had been born from Japan's determination to build the most advanced carrier-based fighter in the world. Designed under Jirō Horikoshi at Mitsubishi, the aircraft entered service in 1940. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded impossible requirements: extreme range, lightning agility, and deadly firepower. Remarkably, Horikoshi's team delivered. The A6M Zero weighed little more than 5,000 pounds fully loaded, yet could travel over 1,900 miles on internal fuel, almost double the range of most American fighters of the time. Its two 20mm Type 99 cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns gave it a punch that outclassed most opponents. With a top speed of around 331 miles per hour and unmatched climb rate, the Zero was engineered for dominance in the skies of Asia and the Pacific. Before the US even entered the war, Chinese pilots flying Curtiss Hawk and Soviet-supplied the 16 fighters had already encountered the Zero. Reports trickled out of China in 1940 to 41, describing a Japanese fighter that could outturn, outclimb, and outrun anything they faced. Allied intelligence dismissed many of these claims as exaggeration. It would take Pearl Harbor to prove they were real. When the first wave of Japanese planes appeared over Oahu on the morning of December 7, 1941, most US personnel assumed they were American aircraft. The Navy's fighters, mainly the Grumman F6F Wildcat, were few in number and caught on the ground. A handful of P-40 Warhawks scrambled to meet the attackers, but they were up against pilots from the Tainan Air Group, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy, flying the Zero. Combat reports in the US National Archives tell the story bluntly. Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor and Lieutenant George Welch, the only two Army pilots able to get airborne in their P-40s, managed to shoot down several enemy planes. But they were the exception. Many others never returned. Surviving American pilots noted with shock that the enemy fighters could simply climb above them at will, then dive and turn in ways their aircraft could not match. In those chaotic hours over Pearl Harbor, the Zero cemented its reputation. It was not just fast and agile, it seemed invincible. The weeks after Pearl Harbor confirmed Allied fears. At Wake Island, Zeros provided air cover as Japanese forces pressed their assault. Despite desperate resistance from Marine aviators flying outdated Wildcats, the garrison fell. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's air forces, mostly P-40s, were devastated on the ground on December 8th. When American and Filipino pilots did get airborne, they found themselves hopelessly outclassed. Reports filed by the Far East Air Force describe dogfights where Zeros simply looped around the heavier P-40s, riddling them with cannon fire. One US pilot wrote in his debriefing, "They could turn inside us every time. We could barely keep them in our sights before they were behind us. It was like fighting a ghost." The Zero's range also stunned Allied commanders. Japanese carriers launched raids farther than expected, and Zeros escorted bombers on missions once thought impossible. At Rabaul, Dutch East Indies, and over Malaya, Allied aircraft, Buffaloes, Hawks, and Hurricanes, fell in droves. By early 1942, the Zero had earned a terrifying mystique. Wherever it appeared, the skies belonged to Japan. The psychological effect on American and Allied airmen cannot be overstated. Many believed the Japanese had developed a superplane, possibly with German or Italian assistance. Rumours swirled about secret engines, experimental alloys, or unknown tactics. Captured Japanese diaries, later archived by Allied intelligence, reveal how confident their aviators felt during this period. One pilot from the Tainan Air Group wrote in January 1942, "The enemy cannot face us. Their planes fall like leaves. We are certain the Emperor has given us wings." This sense of invincibility fueled Japanese expansion. In early 1942, with the Zero at the tip of the spear, Japan controlled vast stretches of the Pacific, from Burma to New Guinea. Against the Zero, American fighters seemed almost obsolete. The F6F Wildcat, sturdy but underpowered, could barely keep up in a dogfight. Its strength lay in durability. It could absorb punishment that would tear a Zero apart. Yet its speed and maneuverability lagged far behind. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, flown by the U.S. Army Air Forces and famously by the Flying Tigers in China, had more speed in a dive and decent firepower, but it was heavier and less agile. Against the Zero's turn radius and climb rate, the Warhawk was constantly at a disadvantage. It quickly became clear that dogfighting a Zero was suicidal. American pilots had to invent new tactics, diving attacks, high-speed slashing maneuvers, and teamwork to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. But in late 1941 and early 1942, these lessons were not yet fully understood. For Japanese aviators, the early months of war were intoxicating. Their rigorous pre-war training, often 700 to 800 flight hours, produced elite pilots unmatched in skill. Combined with the Zero's capabilities, they felt untouchable. US pilots, by contrast, faced despair. Reports filed in January and February 1942 describe units where morale collapsed after repeated losses. Many American squadrons entered combat with fewer hours of flight training than their Japanese opponents, and often in aircraft that seemed outdated from the moment they took off. But American resilience was already stirring. Pilots and engineers alike began studying every scrap of information about the Zero. Crashed aircraft recovered in China and later on Akutan Island in 1942 gave vital insights into the Zero's design and its vulnerabilities. By mid-1942, the Zero had become more than just a fighter plane. It was a legend. Newspapers across the US carried stories of the mystery plane that dominated the Pacific. Pilots whispered about it in ready rooms, half in awe, half in dread. The myth of the Zero was not unfounded. In the first 6 months of the war, it racked up kill ratios that seemed insurmountable. Japanese aces like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa carved their names into aviation history, racking up dozens of victories in the skies. Yet myths can be dangerous. Japanese confidence in the Zero began to harden into arrogance. Engineers in Tokyo hesitated to replace or improve the fighter, believing it unbeatable. Pilots believed their skill would forever outmatch the enemy. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American industry and ingenuity were mobilizing. Engineers at Grumman and the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics were already drafting a fighter that would not just match the Zero, but outgun and outlast it. The early war belonged to the Zero, its myth of invincibility casting a long shadow across the Pacific skies. But myths rarely survive long in modern war. The Allies were learning, adapting, and building. And soon a new machine would appear in the skies, a rugged, powerful fighter that would turn the hunters into the hunted. The Japanese pilots who once felt invincible would soon discover fear. By the summer of 1942, American pilots had endured months of frustration in the skies. Reports from Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had made it abundantly clear. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero outclassed every frontline fighter the United States had in the Pacific. The Wildcat, the Warhawk, even the British Hurricane and Spitfire deployed in Asia, all were at a disadvantage. The US Navy knew something drastic had to be done. It was not enough to simply fight harder. America needed a new fighter, one that could meet the Zero on its own terms and crush it. That answer would come from Grumman, a small company on Long Island whose engineers were already sketching out a replacement for the rugged but outdated F4F Wildcat. The aircraft they produced, the F6F Hellcat, would change the war. After the first 6 months of combat, the US had plenty of data about the Zero's strengths, and just as importantly, its weaknesses. Pilots' debriefing reports preserved in the US National Archives painted a consistent picture. Strengths. The Zero could outturn and outclimb nearly anything. Its long range allowed it to appear almost anywhere. Its cannons shredded Wildcats and P-40S with terrifying ease. Weaknesses. It was fragile. Lacking armour and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Zero could burst into flames after a few hits. It also lost control in high-speed dives, and above 20,000 feet its engine performance fell off sharply. American pilots slowly began exploiting these flaws with new tactics. Boom and zoom diving attacks, coordinated team manoeuvres, but they still needed a plane designed from the ground up to exploit them. Grumman's design team had already been tasked with creating the Wildcat's successor before Pearl Harbor, but after December 7th, the urgency multiplied tenfold. Chief Engineer William Schwendler and test pilot Robert Hall pushed the new fighter forward under the tight supervision of the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. The Navy's requirements were bold. The new fighter had to be tougher, faster, and deadlier than the Zero. It needed long range to match Japanese missions, heavy firepower to bring down bombers and fighters alike, and the ruggedness to survive the punishment of carrier landings and combat damage. What emerged in June 1942 was the prototype F6F Hellcat. At first it was powered by a Wright R-2600 engine, but the Navy quickly realized it needed more. Grumman engineers redesigned the airframe to house the mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial engine that would become one of the most legendary power plants of the war. The Hellcat looked bulky compared to the sleek Zero, but its design philosophy was entirely different. Durability. The fuselage was heavily armoured. The cockpit was protected by bulletproof glass and armour plating, and the aircraft carried self-sealing fuel tanks. Unlike the Zero, it could take hits and keep flying. Firepower. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in the wings gave it devastating firepower, enough to rip apart not only fighters but also bombers. Performance. With the R-2800 engine, the Hellcat could reach speeds over 380 miles per hour, climb rapidly, and, most critically, dive at speeds the Zero could not follow. Range. Equipped with drop tanks, it could cover long distances across the Pacific, escorting bombers or striking far-flung Japanese bases. A Navy test report summarized the Hellcat in blunt terms. This fighter is designed to kill Zeros. Speed was essential. After Pearl Harbor, American industry shifted into overdrive. Grumman's plant in Bethpage, New York, earned the nickname the Iron Works for its relentless production schedules. By August 1942, only 2 months after its first flight, the prototype Hellcat was already showing promise. By January 1943, the F6F-3, the first operational variant, was in full production. Lockheed's records show that more than 12,000 Hellcats would eventually roll off the lines, making it the most produced naval fighter of the war. That industrial might contrasted starkly with Japan, whose strained economy struggled to keep pace and whose pilot training pipeline was already collapsing. The first Navy squadron to receive the Hellcat was VF-9, assigned to USS Essex in early 1943. Pilots transitioning from Wildcats were stunned by the difference. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient flying Wildcats, described the Hellcat as the Wildcat's big brother, stronger, faster, heavier, everything the Zero hates. The Hellcat felt stable on carrier landings, forgiving in flight and deadly in combat drills. pilots found that they could dive steeply without losing control, something that terrified their Zero opponents later in the war. When the Hellcat appeared in combat for the first time in August 1943 during a raid on Marcus Island, Japanese pilots at first mistook it for just another Wildcat. After all, the two aircraft shared a similar silhouette. Combat reports from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary note, "Enemy fighters appear similar to Grumman type. However, they climb with great power and fire heavily. This misjudgment would cost the Japanese dearly. They underestimated the new threat, assuming it was a slightly improved version of the Wildcat. In reality, the Hellcat was designed specifically to annihilate them." The Hellcat reflected a uniquely American approach to air warfare. Where Japanese design emphasized lightness, agility, and offense at the cost of protection, American engineers built their fighter for survivability and power. That philosophy matched America's strengths. With abundant raw materials, vast industrial capacity, and a growing cadre of trained pilots, the US could afford to build heavy, powerful machines that could take losses and keep fighting. Japan, by contrast, relied on elite pre-war pilots flying fragile planes with little ability to replace either quickly. As one US naval aviation historian later put it, "The Hellcat was not just a fighter, it was a statement. It said, 'We will outproduce you, outgun you, and outlast you.'" Combat reports from VF-9 and later squadrons transitioning to the Hellcat are filled with relief and renewed confidence. Pilots who had faced Zeros in Wildcats spoke of feeling like prey. In the Hellcat, they finally felt like hunters. A 13th Fighter Command debrief from late 1943 captured this shift. "In the Wildcat, we avoided a Zero at all costs. In the Hellcat, we go looking for them." The sense of turning the tables electrified the Navy's fighter community. For the first time since December 7th, American pilots believed they had a machine that could dominate the Pacific skies. By the end of 1943, the Hellcat was arriving in numbers. Squadrons across the Pacific were retraining, carriers were being outfitted, and pilots were preparing for a new phase of the air war. The Japanese did not yet fully grasp what was coming. Their Zero still carried the aura of invincibility, and many of their aces still believed no American fighter could match them. But whispers were beginning. Japanese pilots who encountered the new Grumman fighter reported its speed and firepower with unease. The myth of the Zero was about to meet its reckoning. In 1944, the skies over the Marianas, the Philippines, and the Philippine Sea would become the Hellcat's proving ground. The Iron Works fighter was ready, and its arrival would mark the beginning of the end for Japan's aerial supremacy. By mid-1943, the US Navy's fighter arm was in transition. The F6F Wildcat, which had carried the fleet through the desperate early months, was being phased out. In its place came the F6F Hellcat, a bulkier, more powerful machine that promised to finally tilt the balance against the Zero. The question was, would it deliver in combat? The Hellcat's combat debut came on August 31, 1943, during a carrier strike on Marcus Island, a tiny Japanese outpost in the Central Pacific. Squadrons V, F5, VF9, and VF16, flying from carriers Yorktown, Essex, and Independence, took their new Hellcats into battle for the first time. According to US Navy after-action reports preserved by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the engagement was brief but telling. Japanese aircraft scrambled to intercept, including Zeros from local garrisons. Pilots of VF-5 claimed their first aerial victories, downing several Zeros with minimal losses. One American pilot described his shock at the firepower. "The 6.5s chewed through him. I gave a burst and the Zero simply came apart. In the Wildcat, you could pepper them and they kept flying. In the Hellcat, one burst was enough." The Japanese 4th Air Group diary noted the encounter, initially mistaking the new aircraft for improved Wildcats. Their comment was laconic. "Enemy fighters, similar to Grumman type, display unusual power in climb. It was only a small clash, but it proved the Hellcat could face the Zero and win. Through the fall of 1943, the Hellcat became increasingly visible in Pacific skies. Carrier task forces struck at Wake Island in October, where Hellcats again met Zeros in swirling combat. The 13th Fighter Command debriefing reports describe sharp dogfights. Hellcat pilots scored multiple kills, though several also returned with heavy damage. Unlike the Wildcat, however, the Hellcat's rugged design often meant those damaged planes made it back to the deck. By November, the fast carrier groups of the US Pacific Fleet were pressing deeper into Japanese-held territory. The Gilbert's campaign, Tarawa and Makin, brought Hellcats into sustained combat over enemy garrisons and incoming bomber raids. Pilots were learning to trust their new fighter. In these early campaigns, the first Hellcat aces emerged. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter of VF9 became one of the Navy's earliest Hellcat stars, with multiple kills credited in the autumn raids. His accounts, preserved in squadron histories, describe the exhilaration of finally fighting on even terms. "We went hunting. That was the difference. With the Wildcat, we fought defensively, always looking over our shoulder. In the Hellcat, we attacked." Victory credits from the U.S. Army Air Force's Victory Board confirm that by the end of 1943, Hellcats had already claimed hundreds of enemy aircraft. The numbers were modest compared to what was to come, but the trend was unmistakable. For Japanese aviators, 1943 was a year of creeping unease. At first, the Hellcat was dismissed as a Wildcat variant, but by late autumn, surviving pilots were reporting that this new American fighter could climb and dive with frightening speed. Captured Japanese testimonies after the war, recorded in Allied Translator and Interpreter Section (ATIS) interrogations, reveal the gradual shift in morale. "We believed the Zero still had superiority, but the new Grumman fighter was very dangerous. It was heavier, but it carried much firepower, and if it struck you, you could not survive." For a force already suffering from the attrition of veteran pilots, the appearance of a new, superior American fighter was a grim sign of things to come. The Hellcat also changed the way US squadrons fought. With greater speed and climb performance, pilots could finally dictate the terms of engagement. Slashing attacks, high-speed dives, and energy fighting, all the tactics that were risky in Wildcats, became practical and deadly. Naval training manuals from late 1943 emphasized these tactics, drilling home the Hellcat's advantages over the Zero. Do not turn fight, use diving attacks, exploit superior firepower in head-on passes. Trust in the Hellcat's ruggedness. What it can survive, the Zero cannot. These tactical doctrines were reinforced by experience in the Gilberts. As one Hellcat pilot noted in his report, "You didn't need to dogfight him. Stay fast, hit hard, and pull away." He couldn't follow. Perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For nearly a year, US aviators had flown into combat dreading the Zero's agility. Losses were high, morale often fragile. With the Hellcat, that burden lifted. At squadron reunions decades later, veterans consistently remembered the Hellcat as a confidence builder. One pilot at the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion put it simply, "The Hellcat gave us back the initiative. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, we believed we could beat them." By the end of 1943, the Hellcat was proving itself in raids across the Central Pacific. Kill ratios were climbing, production was surging, and new carriers were commissioning with squadrons full of Hellcats. The Japanese, meanwhile, were beginning to feel the strain. Losses of veteran pilots mounted, replacements were undertrained, and the once terrifying Zero was being matched, and often beaten. The true test, however, was still to come. In the summer of 1944, in the skies over the Marianas, the Hellcat would face the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm in its largest and most decisive battle. The legend of the Zero would collide with the reality of the Hellcat in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Hellcat was ready. The Japanese, increasingly, were not. By the summer of 1944, the Hellcat was no longer a newcomer. It was the backbone of U.S. carrier aviation, deployed in overwhelming numbers across the Pacific. Pilots had grown accustomed to its power and survivability, and combat reports showed lopsided kill ratios against the Zero. Yet nothing could have prepared either side for the scale of the clash that erupted over the Marianas in June 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would not only be the largest carrier battle of the war, it would also mark the final destruction of Japan's naval air arm. In the skies over Guam and the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat proved itself beyond doubt, while Japanese pilots faced annihilation in what Americans would soon call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In June 1944, the U.S. launched Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were critical stepping stones, bringing American bombers within range of Japan itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not allow them to fall. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, assembled 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and the remnants of Japan's once elite aviators. His force looked formidable on paper, nearly 450 carrier aircraft reinforced by several hundred land-based planes. Yet appearances hid harsh realities. Many of his pilots had less than 100 flight hours. Few had ever landed on a carrier. By contrast, U.S. aviators had honed their skills through relentless training and months of combat. Facing them was Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, with 15 American carriers and nearly 1,000 Hellcats, Avengers, and dive bombers. The stage was set for a decisive clash. One of the key American advantages lay not in the Hellcat alone, but in radar. By 1944, U.S. carriers and picket ships carried advanced radar systems capable of detecting Japanese raids more than 100 miles away. Fighter directors aboard carriers could then vector Hellcat squadrons precisely onto incoming formations. Naval intelligence records show that when the first Japanese strike force approached on the morning of June 19, 1944, Hellcats were already climbing to intercept before the attackers had sighted the fleet. This technological edge meant that the Zero's long range and stealth, so decisive in 1941, now counted for little. At 10 a.m., over 200 Japanese aircraft, Zeros escorting dive bombers and torpedo planes, streaked toward the American fleet. They never had a chance. Hellcats pounced in disciplined formations, using slashing dives and head-on passes. One pilot from VF-15 recalled in his debriefing, "It was like a gunnery exercise. They kept coming straight at us, and we cut them down. By the time the first wave broke off, more than 40 Japanese planes had been destroyed. Not a single U.S. carrier had been hit. Throughout the day, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft launched from Ozawa's carriers, only to be shredded by Hellcats and radar-directed gunfire. Combat reports from the 13th Fighter Command list entire squadrons of Zeros wiped out before reaching their targets. U.S. pilots quickly realized the disparity in skill. Japanese novices often flew straight and level, unable to evade. As one American said, it was like shooting turkeys on the ground. The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By nightfall, American pilots claimed more than 300 enemy aircraft destroyed. Post-war records from the Allied translator and interpreter section confirm Japanese losses were indeed catastrophic, with over 250 carrier aircraft destroyed and many more lost to crashes during recovery. The loss was more than just numbers. Japan's veteran aviators were nearly gone, and their replacements lacked the experience to cope with the Hellcat's speed and firepower. Captured Japanese officers later admitted in interrogation reports, "We could not match the new American fighter. Our men were inexperienced, and the Hellcat could always choose the fight." Admiral Ozawa's carriers survived the battle, but they were now little more than floating shells. With their air groups annihilated, Japan could no longer contest American control of the skies. The statistics from the Philippine Sea remain staggering. According to the US Navy's after-action report, Hellcat pilots claimed 315 enemy aircraft on June 19th alone. Verified numbers from the US Strategic Bombing Survey put the ratio at approximately 9-1 in favor of the Hellcat. Naval aviators like Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu achieved legendary tallies in single missions. Vrasiu downed 6 Japanese dive bombers in just 8 minutes. His gun camera footage became iconic, reinforcing the Hellcat's reputation as the deadliest naval fighter of the war. For Hellcat pilots, the battle was surreal. Many expected a fierce struggle, but instead they found themselves mowing down poorly trained opponents. Veterans later admitted to mixed emotions: relief at survival, pride in victory, but also recognition that their foes were often inexperienced boys sent to die. One pilot reflected at the 1962 US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, "They were brave, but they were not ready. And we had the Hellcat. It wasn't a fair fight anymore." The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of Japan's naval air arm as an effective force. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was utterly outclassed. Japanese commanders still hoped to win a decisive fleet battle, but without trained pilots, their carriers were powerless. For the Hellcat, the battle was vindication. It had been built to destroy the Zero, and in June 1944, it accomplished that mission on an unprecedented scale. From that point onward, American carriers sailed the Pacific with near-total air supremacy. The skies that once belonged to the Zero were now Hellcat territory, and as the US pushed toward the Philippines and beyond, Japanese pilots would face their worst nightmare every time they climbed into the air, a swarm of Grumman Hellcats waiting for them. By late 1944, the Pacific skies were dominated by the Hellcat. Battles like the Philippine Sea had proven its superiority, but numbers and machines alone do not tell the full story. The war in the air was also a struggle of human endurance, of young pilots catapulted into combat, living day to day with fear, exhaustion, and the knowledge that a single mistake could mean death. This chapter looks beyond the statistics into the lives of the men who flew these aircraft, Americans climbing into the cockpits of Hellcats, and Japanese aviators strapping themselves into Zeros, knowing full well the odds were stacked against them. Life aboard a US carrier in 1944 was a strange mix of monotony and terror. Pilots often spent days waiting, enduring the heat, the cramped bunks, and the endless briefings. Then, without warning, the klaxon would sound, and everything became a blur. Racing to the flight deck, strapping into the cockpit, and being hurled into the sky by a catapult. Pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron and VF units described the surreal rhythm, boredom punctuated by bursts of adrenaline. One Hellcat pilot recalled in his debriefing report, "You spent hours thinking about what might happen. Then suddenly you were in it, guns firing, tracers flashing. When it was over, you almost couldn't believe you were still alive." Japanese pilots endured similar waits on isolated island bases or carriers, though their conditions were often harsher. Fuel and food were scarce, and the knowledge that American raids were coming weighed heavily. Diaries recovered after the war reveal growing dread. One young aviator wrote in 1944, "We are told to fly tomorrow. Few expect to return. The Hellcat is faster, stronger. It is like going against a storm." The quality of training became one of the defining contrasts between American and Japanese pilots by 1944. Pre-war Japanese aviators had been among the best in the world, with 700 to 800 hours of training before combat. But by 1944, with attrition devastating the ranks, replacements were being rushed into combat with fewer than 100 hours, barely enough to master basic flight. The US, meanwhile, expanded its training program dramatically. By 1943 to 44, thousands of pilots were cycling through stateside bases and advanced gunnery schools. They entered combat with solid fundamentals and the advantage of being paired with veterans who had survived earlier campaigns. This divergence showed in the cockpit. American pilots trusted their machines and their wingmen. Japanese rookies often flew straight and level, unable to evade, making them easy prey. The Hellcat itself became a source of comfort for its pilots. Unlike the cramped Wildcat, the F6F had a spacious cockpit, armoured seat, and strong canopy. Survivors often credited these features with saving their lives. One VF-27 pilot remembered being hit over the Philippines. A Zero got behind me and stitched the fuselage. The whole plane shuddered, but she kept flying. I nursed her back to the carrier, holes all through the tail. In any other plane, I'd have been gone. This toughness gave pilots confidence. They knew they could take risks, attack aggressively, and still have a good chance of making it home. For the Japanese in their lightly built Zeros, by contrast, a single burst from 6.50 caliber guns was often fatal. Combat was as much psychological as physical. US pilots began to notice that Japanese formations often broke apart when Hellcats appeared. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded the Zero had reversed. Now it was the Hellcat that inspired dread. A Japanese officer captured after the war admitted during interrogation in 1945. When we saw the Hellcat, we knew the fight was already lost. We attacked because we had to, not because we believed we could win. This shift in morale was profound. American pilots went into combat expecting victory. Japanese pilots entered the same fights bracing for death. Yet the Hellcat was no guarantee of safety. Combat remained brutal, and many young aviators never returned. Even with the Hellcat's advantages, flak, accidents, and sheer chance claimed lives daily. Carrier decks were dangerous places. Crashes during landings often killed more pilots than enemy fire. A veteran of VF2 recalled, "We lost as many men to accidents as to the enemy." The sea doesn't forgive mistakes. For the Japanese, the odds were far worse. By 1944 to 45, the majority of Zero pilots were killed in their first few missions. Survivors described seeing friends vanish in fireballs, entire squadrons wiped out in minutes. The experience was devastating, yet they continued to fly, bound by duty and the Bushido spirit instilled by their commanders. Both sides shared the same reliance on camaraderie. Hellcat pilots spoke of the ready room family, where laughter, nerves, and grim humour eased the tension. Japanese pilots, too, formed tight bonds, though their letters and diaries reveal a more fatalistic tone, often writing final farewells to families before missions. At the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, American and Japanese aviators met face-to-face. Many described the relief of discovering that their former enemies had felt the same fear and the same longing for survival. One Japanese veteran told his American counterpart, "We feared your Hellcat, but we respected your courage. We were young men on both sides, caught in something larger than us." By 1945, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. The Hellcat's dominance, combined with overwhelming American production and pilot training, had reduced the Zero from predator to prey. But for the men flying these machines, victory was always personal, measured in missions survived, friends lost, and the hope of seeing home again. The cockpit was both shield and coffin, a place where life and death were decided in seconds. And though the machines told part of the story, it was the men, brave, frightened, determined, who carried the war forward. For the Japanese, that war in the air was slipping away. The Hellcat had become not only a weapon, but a symbol of inevitability. And as 1945 dawned, the skies over the Pacific belonged almost entirely to America's Iron Works fighter. By late 1944, the contest between the Zero and the Hellcat was no longer just about tactics or pilot skill. It had become a war of numbers, a brutal equation of production, attrition, and replacement that Japan could not hope to solve. While the Hellcat proved itself superior in combat, it was America's ability to produce thousands of them and to train pilots to fly them that truly broke Japan's air power. Japan entered the Pacific War with a formidable air force and the most advanced carrier fighter of its day. But the empire's industrial base was small compared to the United States. Aircraft factories in Nagoya, Omura, and Yokosuka turned out hundreds of Zeros each month at their peak, but they were hampered by shortages of aluminum, steel, and fuel. By 1944, bombing raids and transport bottlenecks had further strangled production. In total, Japan produced about 10,900 Zeros between 1940 and 1945, an impressive number until it is compared to American output. Grumman's Iron Works in Bethpage, New York, with its relentless 24-hour shifts, produced 12,275 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. American factories were not being bombed. They had access to vast raw materials and an ever-expanding workforce, including thousands of women filling the ranks as machinists, riveters, and engineers. By 1944, US factories could outproduce Japan 10-1. Production alone did not tell the full story. Attrition, the steady drain of aircraft and pilots, was decisive. Japanese aviation had been built around a small core of elite pilots trained extensively before the war. In 1941, men like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa could make the Zero seem invincible. But combat losses steadily consumed this cadre, and Japan lacked the infrastructure to replace them. By 1944, new pilots were arriving at the front with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, compared to 400 to 500 for their American counterparts. The result was catastrophic. Veteran Japanese aces were being lost faster than they could be replaced, while inexperienced recruits were being thrown into the teeth of Hellcat formations. Reports captured after the war describe entire squadrons of rookies destroyed in their first engagement. The US, by contrast, rotated experienced aviators back to training commands, where they passed on their knowledge to new classes. The system created a sustainable pipeline of competence, something Japan never developed. The disparity in training and technology translated directly into combat statistics. According to the US Navy's official tally, Hellcats were credited with 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed during World War II. The vast majority of these were Japanese. The kill ratio was extraordinary. Across the Pacific, Hellcats achieved approximately a 19-1 ratio against the Zero. Even when the numbers are corrected against Japanese loss records compiled by the Allied translator and interpreter section, the ratio remains overwhelmingly lopsided. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea alone, Hellcats destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, for the loss of around 20 of their own. Such outcomes were not isolated, they became the norm. For Japanese aviators, these numbers were not abstract. They lived the consequences every day. Diaries and post-war testimonies described the despair of seeing entire squadrons cut down. One pilot recalled after the war, "We rose into the sky with 10 aircraft. I was the only one who returned. The Americans were many, and their Hellcats poured fire. It was no longer combat, it was slaughter." The psychological toll was immense. Even before missions, pilots knew the odds were against them. In some cases, commanders began to treat their men as expendable, culminating in the rise of kamikaze tactics in late 1944. Beyond production and training, logistics further widened the gap. American carriers sailed with spare aircraft, parts, and a constant flow of replacements. When a Hellcat was shot down, another often filled its place within weeks. Fuel supplies allowed long training flights and regular combat patrols. Japan, in contrast, faced crippling shortages. Fuel for training was so scarce that pilots sometimes practiced maneuvers in classrooms using chairs to simulate cockpits. Engines were in short supply, leaving some aircraft grounded indefinitely. When planes were lost, they could not be replaced quickly, if at all. By 1945, Japan had aircraft sitting idle on airfields for lack of gasoline, while American carrier decks overflowed with freshly delivered Hellcats. War is often romanticized as a contest of courage or brilliance, but in the Pacific skies of 1944 and 1945, numbers dictated fate. Courage was abundant on both sides. American and Japanese pilots alike flew into mortal danger, but the resources behind them were not equal. The Hellcat was a superb machine, but it was also the product of an industrial system capable of mass-producing excellence. The Zero had once been a marvel, but it belonged to an economy that could no longer sustain the fight. These numerical realities also shaped perception. By late 1944, US pilots entered combat confident not just in their planes, but in the knowledge that reinforcements, spare parts, and fuel were always behind them. For Japanese pilots, the opposite was true. They flew with the sense that each mission might be their last, and that their sacrifice would not turn the tide. One Japanese officer, interrogated in 1946, summed it up bluntly. "We could not hope to win. For every one of us, there were 10 Americans. For every Zero, there were 10 Hellcats. Numbers decided everything." By the end of 1944, the Zero was no longer the standard of Japanese air power. New fighters, such as the Kawanishi N-1K George and Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, appeared, capable of challenging American aircraft on more even terms. But they came too late, in too few numbers, and with too few trained pilots. The numbers war had already been lost. The Hellcat, produced by the thousands, flown by well-trained men and sustained by the richest industrial base in the world, had reduced Japan's once proud Zero to a relic. The skies of the Pacific told the story. Wrecks of Zeros littered island airfields, while Hellcats roared overhead in formation after formation. Victory was now only a matter of time. The war in the Pacific ended in September 1945 with Japan's surrender, but the story of the Hellcat and the Zero did not end there. In the years that followed, captured diaries, interrogation reports, and symposiums between former enemies revealed how Japanese aviators had experienced the air war, and how the arrival of the Hellcat transformed their outlook from confidence to despair. These testimonies shed light not just on combat, but on the psychological collapse of Japan's naval air power. In 1941–42, Japanese pilots viewed the Zero as a symbol of national pride. Captured diaries from the 4th Air Group, preserved in US archives, describe an almost religious faith in the fighter. One pilot wrote after the attack on Pearl Harbor, "The Zero is faster, more agile. The enemy cannot hope to match us." This confidence carried into the early campaigns. The Zero's long range and agility made it appear invincible, and Japanese aviators interpreted their victories as proof of Japan's superiority in spirit and training. But the tone changed dramatically after 1943. By then, the Hellcat had entered service, and US pilots were using disciplined tactics and radar control to counter the Zero. Post-war interrogations show that Japanese aviators quickly recognized they were facing a new and dangerous adversary. Several pilots interrogated in 1945–46 admitted they first underestimated the Hellcat. From a distance, it resembled the older Wildcat, which they had fought since 1942. But in combat, its speed, climb, and durability shocked them. A pilot from the 261st Naval Air Group described his first encounter. "At first I thought it was a Wildcat. I turned tightly to shake him, but he stayed behind me. His guns fired, and my plane shook. I realized too late it was something new." Others recalled the terror of seeing entire formations of Hellcats. Where once a few Zeros had dominated skies over Wake or Rabaul, now dozens of American fighters arrived in disciplined squadrons. One diary entry from 1944 reads, "The Hellcat comes in groups like waves. We scatter, but they follow. Our young pilots do not last long. It feels hopeless." Post-war Japanese officers consistently highlighted the decline in training as decisive. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, veterans openly admitted that by 1944 their pilots were unprepared for modern air combat. Admiral Minoru Genda, who had planned Pearl Harbor, later reflected, "The Zero was still agile, but our men no longer had the skill to use it. The Americans had better machines and better training. We could not catch up." In contrast, Hellcat pilots were not only well prepared, but backed by radar-controlled interception, teamwork, and plentiful fuel for practice. This imbalance in training hours made Japanese rookies easy prey. Captured diaries often dwell on fear, an emotion rarely acknowledged in Japanese wartime propaganda. A Zero pilot at Truk wrote in early 1944, "We are told to fight bravely. But when the Hellcat appears, we know we cannot win. My comrades are falling every day. I pray for survival, yet I know it is unlikely." Such admissions reveal the collapse of morale. Where American pilots entered combat expecting victory, many Japanese aviators flew expecting death. This fatalism contributed to the rise of kamikaze operations in late 1944. For many young pilots, death in a suicide mission seemed no worse than death in a hopeless dogfight against Hellcats. When American and Japanese veterans met at the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the conversations were marked by candor and reconciliation. For many, it was the first time they had spoken openly to their former adversaries. One Japanese veteran told his U.S. counterpart, "When we saw the Hellcat, we knew the war was over. We feared it more than any other plane, but we respected the men who flew it." An American pilot responded, "We respected you too. You kept flying even when you must have known it was hopeless." These exchanges underscored the shared humanity of men once locked in mortal combat. Both sides acknowledged bravery, while also recognizing the tragedy of wasted youth and lopsided odds. For Japanese aviators, the Hellcat became not just a machine, but a symbol of inevitability. By 1944–45, its presence in the sky signaled overwhelming American strength, industrial, tactical, and psychological. Post-war testimonies repeatedly emphasized this point. A former Zero pilot, interviewed in 1946, said bluntly, "The Hellcat broke our spirit." We knew then Japan could not win. For historians, these words capture the moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility crumbled, replaced by grim acceptance of defeat. While statistics confirm the Hellcat's dominance, kill ratios of nearly 19-1, thousands of victories claimed, these testimonies remind us that the war was also experienced on a personal level. For each number was a man, a pilot strapped into a fragile machine, balancing fear and duty. Japanese aviators described the Hellcat as relentless, deadly, and unavoidable. American pilots remembered it as tough, forgiving, and decisive. Together, their voices tell the story of how one machine reshaped the Pacific skies. By 1945, the Zero was obsolete, and Japanese testimonies made clear they knew it. Though newer fighters like the N-1K George and Kai-84 Frank showed promise, they arrived in too few numbers, with too few trained men. The Hellcat had already won the psychological war. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, both sides carried memories of those duels into peace. For the Japanese, the Hellcat symbolized a nightmare they could not escape. For the Americans, it symbolized the weapon that secured victory and survival. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the skies over the Pacific were no longer contested. American naval air power, spearheaded by the Hellcat, reigned supreme. The Mitsubishi Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to wreckage on remote island airstrips. The Hellcat, meanwhile, had carved out a place in history as one of the most successful fighters ever built. Yet its story does not end with statistics of kills and losses. The Hellcat's legacy is also cultural, strategic, and deeply human. The raw numbers remain staggering. Between 1943 and 1945, Hellcat pilots were credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft in the Pacific, the most aerial victories of any U.S. Navy fighter in history. According to the USAAF Victory Credits Board and Navy after-action reports, the Hellcat achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of roughly 19-1 against the Zero. Japan, despite producing nearly 11,000 Zeros during the war, lost the majority of them in combat, often against Hellcats. Verified post-war records from the Allied translator and interpreter section confirm that by 1944–45, entire Zero units were annihilated in single engagements. For the men who flew them, these numbers were more than statistics. They were the daily reality of survival or loss. Every victory tallied by an American squadron often meant dozens of grieving families in Japan. Every Hellcat that returned to its carrier, riddled with holes, was a testament to both machine and pilot. The Hellcat's role in achieving U.S. victory in the Pacific cannot be overstated. It allowed the Navy to seize and hold air superiority during critical campaigns, from the Gilberts and Marshalls to the Marianas, the Philippines, and finally Okinawa. Without control of the skies, amphibious operations would have been nearly impossible. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 crystallized this role. By destroying Japan's naval air arm in a single campaign, Hellcat pilots ensured that future American landings would go largely unopposed from the air. In effect, the Hellcat cleared the way for the island-hopping strategy that carried U.S. forces within bombing range of Japan. Strategically, the Hellcat also embodied the U.S. advantage in combined arms. It was not just a superior fighter, it was part of a system that included radar, fighter direction, logistics, and training. Together, these elements created an unstoppable machine of war that Japan could not counter. For many Americans during the war, the Zero remained a symbol of Japanese ferocity. Newspaper headlines and wartime propaganda often portrayed it as a dangerous, almost mystical adversary. Films and posters warned pilots not to underestimate it, even after the Hellcat had rendered it obsolete. In Japan, the Zero became a bittersweet emblem of both national pride and ultimate defeat. Post-war memoirs describe it with reverence, even as they acknowledge its limitations. To many Japanese veterans, the Zero symbolized the courage of those who flew against impossible odds. The Hellcat, by contrast, was remembered less as a romantic symbol and more as a workhorse. Grumman's engineers had designed it for survivability and firepower, not elegance. Pilots nicknamed it the aluminum tank and the ace maker. Its legacy was one of effectiveness rather than mystique, an image reinforced by its unmatched combat record. Despite their differences, both American and Japanese pilots shared an intimate bond with their machines. Hellcat veterans often credited the aircraft with saving their lives. One pilot remarked in a 1945 debriefing, "I never felt alone in a Hellcat. She could take punishment and bring you home. You trusted her with everything." Japanese aviators expressed similar feelings for the Zero, though tinged with sorrow. A post-war diary entry from a surviving pilot read, "The Zero was like a sword, light, sharp, deadly. But against the Hellcat, it shattered. Still, we loved her because she was ours." Such testimonies reveal that beyond numbers, these aircraft carried emotional weight. They were extensions of the men who flew them, tools of war, but also companions in moments of fear and triumph. The decades after the war saw efforts at reconciliation between former adversaries. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, veterans and historians debated the relative merits of the Hellcat and the Zero. What emerged was less a technical comparison than an acknowledgement of shared experience. American pilots marveled at the courage of Japanese aviators who flew obsolete Zeros against overwhelming odds. Japanese veterans admitted their awe at the Hellcat's durability and firepower. Both sides recognized that bravery and sacrifice had been universal, even if the outcomes were not. By the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the tone had shifted further toward reconciliation. Former foes shook hands, shared memories, and admitted that in many ways they had been more alike than different. Young men asked to risk everything in fragile machines. The Hellcat and the Zero represent two contrasting approaches to air warfare. The Zero was built for offense, lightweight, agile, and lethal in the hands of experts, but fragile. The Hellcat embodied defense and sustainability, armored, powerful, and forgiving, designed to bring ordinary pilots home. The contrast reflected broader truths about the two nations at war. Japan emphasized spirit, skill, and sacrifice, but lacked the industrial base to sustain losses. America emphasized production, protection, and systems, and could replace men and machines indefinitely. In the end, it was this balance, technology matched with industrial capacity and training, that secured American victory. The Hellcat was not just a fighter, it was the physical embodiment of an entire strategy. Today, surviving Hellcats rest in museums such as the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, their blue-grey paint still gleaming. A few remain airworthy, flown at air shows as reminders of the era when naval aviation decided the fate of nations. The Zero, too, is preserved, rarer, but revered as a symbol of Japanese ingenuity and sacrifice. When a restored Zero takes to the skies today, it is not seen as an enemy, but as part of a shared history. Together, the Hellcat and the Zero tell a story of transformation. They remind us of a time when the Pacific was filled with dueling machines, when the fate of battles and nations depended on the courage of pilots in cramped cockpits. They also remind us that war is not only about weapons, but about people, those who built, flew, and fought in them. And in that legacy, one truth remains. The Hellcat outgunned the Zero, and in doing so, it helped shape the course of the 20th century.